I'm delighted to see you all here. We started this blog because there's so much happening in education in DC and so much interest in it, and not enough coverage and not enough spaces where people can exchange ideas. So we're trying to create a place that we do that, and I think it's coming along, and we need people like you to read and also contribute. So if any of you come across a great idea for a blog post, or you know of some developments that you think we should be aware of and writing about, please let us know. But tonight we are here to have a conversation with David Catania, my contributor to Greater Education, Ken Archer, will also be posing some questions. And so the format will be, I'm going to sit down. I think everybody can hear me okay with that. We're just going to, Ken and I will each ask, and I'm sure David Catania needs no introduction to this group, but he is a council member, an at-large council member. We're going to start, we'll each ask him a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to you all to ask questions. We also may be getting some questions via Twitter, but there's plenty to talk about. So if you guys run out of questions, Ken and I have plenty in reserve. So I'd like to start with, you've recently formed an exploratory committee in connection with a possible mayoral bid, and you've said that one reason you would like to be mayor, maybe, is that you would be able to do more for education as mayor than as a council member. So, but you actually wanted to say a few words before I said
it was, boy, she just went right for the throat, didn't she?
I did.
Well, if you don't mind, just a few minutes of introduction. Thank you for hosting tonight. My name is David Catania. I'm the chairman of the Committee on Education. I recognize a number of faces that I've seen in the crowds before from some of the presentations that we've made. So I have a bit of truncated introductory remarks, and we'll go straight to questions. This is a job that I've wanted chairman of the Committee on Education a couple of years ago. It was at the time, the chairman decided that we would keep the education matters within the committee of the whole as opposed to a separate committee. But fortunately this year, Chairman Mendelson decided to carve out a separate education committee, and I was lucky enough to be named chairman. My colleagues on the committee are Councilmember Wells, who's the Ward 6 member, Councilmember Grasso, who is at large, and then Councilmember Berry, Councilmember Evans from Wards 8, Alexander from Wards 8 and 7. The last year has been a remarkable year, and I think, as I've made clear in my other presentations, I had an ambitious goal when I became chairman, and that was to get the members of the committee really engaged in education. Before, when the subject matter was in the committee of the whole, it was really hard to have 13 people engaged. No one or two people actually felt an ownership of the issue, but with 5 members, it was really important for me that we each get our hands around the subject. And so we started visiting each of our schools last week, and many of the members come. They don't come to all. Some come more than others, but the idea is to get as many of us to as many schools as possible. And last week we finished our 102nd school visit. These are really important visits because they're not simply drive-bys or cameos. They last between an hour and a half and 2 hours. And we go through a whole host of data to begin with, from CAS scores to truancy to demographics and modernization and budgets and so on. And then we spend about half the time talking to kids. And I particular gateway grades and particular questions that I like to ask because I'm gathering information on the strength of the theater and parental influences or parental impressions as well. By and large, I'm thrilled with the quality of the leadership that I have been seeing in our public schools. And by way of public schools, I mean both charter and traditional public. Of the 102 schools, I'm impressed overwhelmingly with the quality and caliber and commitment of the leadership, and impressed with the teaching staff that we have. Now, having said that, we have a lot still to do, and so we take our success and then we try to build it on. Now, if you like, I can go into questions, or I can answer the question that you.
Well, yes. The question which I was about to ask was, what, if you can briefly summarize what you might do if you were mayor, what you might do differently with regard to education, and either maybe one overarching idea, or maybe 3 specific things?
Well, I think through the course of questions, you'll get a better idea of my priorities. It's really hard to narrow into one particular issue that you would do. But let me say this, that while we have made progress in our public education system, it has yet to be the #1 guiding issue of our executive. Candidly, our government has been so siloized that we have yet to knit it together in a way that all of the various parts of our government are focused on setting children up to succeed. The most efficient way to defeat poverty in this that has ever been constructed is education. And we have some incredible income inequality in our city that can be linked to the failure of our educational system. And so as a city, we have to decide, are we going to continue to do the things as business as usual? And while we've had some modest improvements, is that fast enough or is that enough? And when you have income diversity and income inequality that exists in the city, I don't believe that our current pace of change is sufficient. Among other things, I would look at, and we'll have a chance to get into, how we might improve our feeder systems. Because right now, the way they're organized, I think they're organized to defeat themselves, not to succeed. The types of distribution of resources to make sure that our kids who are at risk have the resources necessary to compete and succeed. Whether we look at how we set our kids up for post high school. In other words, the DC Promise Bill legislation. How do we make college affordable? All of these things conspire together. But if I could use just one example of where I think the city needs to do a better job working together. My last school visit was Cedar Tree, which is on Howard Road in Ward 8, where 82 of the 322 children are in transitional housing or homeless. And so it illustrates perfectly why, and the rest who are not, are eligible for TANF and or SNAP. So you have a school where there's an intense degree of poverty. And so obviously you can see the need for enhanced mental health services there. You can see the need for a relationship with our Department of Human Services there. And so, but to have these siloized means that we're not really uniting our government, leveraging this investment, and making it a priority for the school. One of the things I like to say, because one of the things I like to impart is the need for us to have excellence in every school for every child without exception. That is not something that we have embraced as a city. We have allowed there to be exceptions to excellence in schools and excellence for every child. And so reorienting our whole government to say that we will not have exceptions to this, it's something that I don't believe we have done up until now.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a question about school boundaries. Various ideas for boundaries have come up. Councilmember Jack Evans, who's running for mayor, supports boundaries for charter schools. Mayor Gray supports cross-DCPS charter boundaries. But in other cities, like in San Francisco, they don't have school boundaries at all on the premise that school boundaries are inherently prejudicial and even racist, given how little diversity there is in those neighborhoods. So do you agree with that, or do you agree with any of these other proposals on boundaries? What would you do with boundaries if you could make decisions?
The issue of boundaries, like few others, really stokes divisiveness and fear within our city. And I'll give you just a couple of illustrations. Presently, for whether it's realistic or real or not, the perception is that Deal is the only high-quality traditional public middle school option. And the fact that progress is being made at our other middle schools, people are still unwilling to invest their children in something that they don't view as top quality. And so, as soon as the issue of boundaries came up, there are certain schools that feed into the Hardy and or Deal, well, let's just use Deal in particular, feed into Deal that were fearful that they would be carved out. And most, top of the list was Shepherd, convinced that they would be carved out. And immediately that begins east of the park, west of the park discussion, issues of race and socioeconomics start getting injected. And the reason for that is the parents in that school don't feel that they, number one, have a middle school that could serve their community, or two, that it would be of quality equal to or better than Deal. And so I think any discussion of boundaries that doesn't address the fact that we don't have equal high-quality spaces across the city just sets up a discussion of us versus them, who wins, who loses. And so I would like to see, while we're discussing boundaries and feeders, I'd like to see, what are we going to do to make sure that there's a high-quality seat in every community? one of the measures the council passed last week, the Fair Funding Bill, which I authored over the summer, produces an at-risk weight for students who are homeless, foster care, who are eligible for TANF or eligible for SNAP, which is a Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, up to 200% of poverty. And so what it would do is it would provide additional resources for kids in this category, and also for high school students who are 1 year or more older than their peers. And so this would get at kids who have failed in an effort to give additional resources so they can get back on track. You know, in the absence of some resources that accounts for this income inequality and the challenges that these children face where they're in concentrations of poverty, you know, you continue to see this diaspora from east to west as parents seek what they perceive as higher quality schools, but in reality are places where just less poverty exists, where there's a better chance to get, you know, the time and attention your child needs. So number one, I think actually producing this at-risk weight, stabilizing and improving neighborhood schools and charter schools across the city is an important first step. Improving the feeder system is the next. I think these are the issues that are the most pressing. We have some communities where, for instance, boundaries are important because we have overcrowding, and there are very, very few of those schools for which they're simply overcrowding the issue, and they're clustered mostly in Ward 3. But in most schools, most feeder systems, you have failed middle schools, which are forcing families to choose charter schools or try to get lucky enough to get into a Hardy or Deal feeder pattern. So, you know, what I would do, I would distribute the resources so at-risk students would have a chance, stabilize the elementary schools, come up with a middle school strategy that I'm happy to talk about, maybe a future question, and then let the system build upon itself.
Those tactics to increase the number of quality seats citywide, though, are probably unlikely to have an impact before there is real overcrowding at Deal and Wilson, right?
We have real crowding at Deal, and this year, for this last summer, we had to invest almost $9 million to expand Deal further. You know, meanwhile, Hardy, which is right down the street, is about where you live, right? Is about a third empty, right? And so, what's the status of Wilson now? And by the way, you know, my answers are long. I apologize, but I think, you know, imparting information is helpful. And this is where visiting 102 schools and having these serious conversations really helps. It's about going back to the schools and staying in touch with the administrators and so on. And so Wilson has shed about 80 or 90 students from last year. And so they're now at about 1,703, which if you ask the principal, Mr. Cahall will tell you that's a good number. He can manage that number. And they shed about 80 or so students, and these were students who were chronically truant, for whom he thought it was best that they attend a neighborhood school because transportation and other issues were making it hard to attend, etc. And so at 1,700, that's sustainable. But, you know, one of the things we have to look at is you know, and I don't believe we brought copies. Did we bring copies of the feeder system, the feeder pattern? If we didn't, they're on our website, davidcatania.com. We actually went through, and I've got a very, you know, hardworking data person in the office. If this guy ever gets hit by a bus, I mean, I'd be rendered completely useless. We went back and we built for ourselves what the feeder patterns look like in terms of how many fifth graders are eligible for the middle school and so on and so on. There is a huge reservoir of people going through the Deal feeder system. And I've seen people from Key, I know, who are in boundary for Hardy, rent apartments in the Deal feeder pattern so they can secure a place for their child. And so, you know, what are we doing about this right now? There's no elegant, simple solution. If there were a magical elixir, we would pour it on it and walk away. But there's no easy way to do this, but there is a way. All right, so let's start with what are the offerings, and let's use the Hardy Deal comparison. How many here think that the course offerings at Hardy are the same as Deal? Some do, some don't. They're not. All right. And in the area of mathematics, and I use this illustration, and I've used it before, but I think it's illustrative of the situation. So at Deal, you'll have Algebra 2, and you'll have Geometry. At Hardy, that fits into the same high school, you have 5 kids who are in Geometry as opposed to 100. And they take the Geometry class at Duke Ellington, not on their own premises. And the top math class they're eligible for is Algebra 1. So even if you're looking at equal quality, you're not necessarily looking at equal programming. And it may seem somewhat simplistic, but I'm happy to talk about how I think the school system would be better served being more vertically integrated. But horizontally, there needs to be some equity in terms of course offerings. And so perhaps now would be a good time to talk about how the system is organized. Okay? So we have 10 instructional superintendents over at DCPS, and if you want, I'm happy to talk about charter schools as well. We have 10 instructional superintendents, and we organize ourselves horizontally. So elementary schools have superintendents, the educational campuses have a superintendent, the middle school has a superintendent, and the high schools, right? And so there's very little discussion that goes like this. And so let's use Woodson as an example. There are 8 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and then you have the high school. So programmatically, of those 10 schools, 1 will be a STEM, and 1 will be an art, and 1 will be this. So you don't have programmatic alignment. You also very often don't have curriculum alignment, and you certainly don't have organizational development alignment. And so what do I mean by that? The 8 elementary school principals ought to have a bandwidth of expectation of what their 5th graders are, the levels that they are performing at as they go to 6th grade. They should be sitting together, aligning, the issues that I've just discussed. They should also be in regular conversations with the middle school principal, and he or she should be looking back and looking down from a supply chain perspective. And it goes all the way up from the high school, right? In some successful systems, you'll actually have the principal of the high school who serves on hiring committee for the other principals. And so that's a part of an integrated organizational development. Even within specific schools, you have to have a chain, an assistant principal ready to assume, okay? And so I mentioned, my experience in the private sector. We would never hire someone who had not been with the company to, even if they had done well someplace else, to run a multi-million-dollar operation. You grow your talent from within, and you create that infrastructure. Now, there are times when you don't have any choice, and you have to go outside. And we've done a lot of that recently. And so now that we've done it, we need to commit to making sure that we have some stability in our principal rank, and then begin these conversations. Because in the absence of it, and in the absence of a vertical integration and horizontal equality and the resources that can make success happen, we're not setting these children up to succeed. Because we're not setting their teachers up to succeed. And we're not setting their principals up and their schools.
Well, my next question was going to be on middle schools, so it's a good segue. And you've covered some of it, but I guess there's sort of 2 questions. I mean, do you think that equity in course offerings and vertical integration of the sort you're talking about is really going to be enough to turn around some of the middle schools? And as a secondary question, there's been a lot of coverage and talk about a recent hearing on the boundary review process in which Chancellor Kaya Henderson testified, and she said something about middle DCPS not having been successful in attracting families to middle schools. And it has been reported as she suggested that we simply funnel kids to charter schools for middle schools. And I'm wondering, do you think she meant that seriously?
So let me say that a lot of folks have tried to drive, and I'm not suggesting that you are. A lot of people have tried, because this town thrives on conflict, has tried to create conflict between me and the chancellor. There are some things with which I agree, and some things that I don't. I view myself as a partner in leadership, but not a subordinate agency. So we're clear. I believe, she meant that we should explore more how to use charter schools. Perhaps. I was left though with the impression that she didn't have necessarily a middle school plan of her own, and not verbalizing her middle school plan and suggesting that charter schools do it better left people with the impression that she was abandoning middle schools. And I was pleased to hear that she's decided, that we're going to look at resourcing middle schools better. But one of the things I would do is I'd start looking at middle schools where we do things well. So Deal is the highest performing middle school in the city. So let's look at what Deal does well. Similarly, I do think there are things that we can learn from some of our charter schools. And the second highest performing charter school in this city, if I'm not mistaken, I want to see a show of hands, who thinks they know what it is? Wait, which kid? Sorry about that. You're close. DC Prep does outstanding work. They're close. It's actually Key Academy on Benny Road.
That was going to say Benny Road.
And but DC Prep in Ward 5 does incredible work as well. So when I asked David, the middle school principal at Key, have you ever had an occasion to talk with DCPS about why you are succeeding? Because they're succeeding in an environment that is somewhat different than exists at Deal. How are you able to succeed on Benny Road? And that's a conversation that the chancellor should be having, and whomever is in charge of middle schools should be having with David. What do you do differently? I don't think everything comes back to money. I think it also comes back to expectations. And right now, with this disoriented feeder system on the DCPS side, failure kind of cascades up. And I'll share with you just a couple of illustrations. I mentioned that when we visit schools, I like to talk to fifth graders. I like to talk to eighth graders because I want to know where they're going next. And kids are really honest. And so you start with banter about who's cooking for Thanksgiving or those kinds, and then it leads to questions about where are you going to middle school, where are you going to high school. And I've had one interesting example after another. Hart is Simon is a great example. Simon, which is on Mississippi Avenue, is located across the street from Hart and across the street from Anacostia. And so when I asked the two classes of fifth graders at Simon, where were you going to middle school, not one of the students mentioned Hart. Two students just volunteered Hardy, which then, of course, you start to think, well, you'd rather go across town than across the street. But it's not limited to just Simon. The same is true if you ask kids from Garfield or you ask from Turner, where would you like to go to middle school? Universally, they'll say Pitt. Or if you're at Seton or at Cleveland, they're not saying that they want to go to middle school at Cardozo. They're saying Cesar Chavez. And so what I'm encouraging the principals above to do is to go down and drill deep and go ask talk to your future customers, the parents of these fifth graders, and ask, what are your preferences and what do we need? Now the reality is that most of these kids don't get to go to where they want to go because there are limited spaces. And so often DCPS will say, well look, our enrollment is good, it's steady, and it's growing. That I think is more a function of spaces than real desire.
Well, maybe we should see if members of the audience have some questions. Yeah.
I would like to know what significant qualities, because you mentioned it a lot, what significant qualities have you seen from the leaders of the school of Deal, the leaders that actually the principals, the administration of Deal that have made a great impact on their school that are lacking in many of the middle schools in our area and throughout DC?
For starters, Principal Cahall has loosely done what I've suggested in terms of his vertical integration. He has monthly meetings with his other principals, which I think is helpful. Number two, I think the kids that feed into Deal are all more or less very high-performing elementary schools. So the caliber of the student that they are getting, they're starting with a pretty successful, or students who are more or less prepared to succeed. And so it's really about cascading success upward. And then you start with a school of that size, and there are resources enough so that they have the aggregate resources for some of this additional programming. I don't think any of this is beyond the reach of any of our feeder systems. I can't tell you I've been to one school that I thought wasn't capable of doing better. But there has to be a sense of urgency, and I use Drew as an example all the time. He was named after, father of a former colleague of mine. So when you have Drew Elementary School, where it still has in the teens proficiency, it's feeding into the same middle school where there's a neighboring elementary school, Burville, that's doing 3 times as better. How do these kids, if you're at all these various levels, they hit middle school? How is that middle school set up to succeed? And so, I need a sense of urgency right now with respect to Drew, by the way, and there are others, Aton, C.W. Harris. I need a sense of urgency instead of expectations. This is what's going to happen. And it isn't about scaring the bejesus out of principals and serially changing principals and teachers. It's about, what are the resources, what's going to take to make this school a success? And I just haven't seen that personally. You want to call it?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the children who are going into Deal have had success previously in other institutions, and we can attribute a lot of that to parents. We know that teachers are the most influential school-based factor.
Right.
Children spend a heck of a lot of time with their parents. So if you are mayor, how would you prepare more parents who live east of the river or in challenging circumstances to be effective parents at school, to be people who can successfully channel their students through elementary school, perhaps have the education that they did not have, but what they aspire to have for their children?
I think it first starts with home visitation in elementary school. And so we've had a number of schools go through the Flamboyant Foundation, where Flamboyant Foundation supports teaching teachers how to conduct safe home visits, where you express as a teacher your expectations for the child and seek to solicit the same from the parent. That's a very important first step in building a respectful relationship. And in some of our schools that have had it, we've seen great improvements in proficiency, CAS proficiency, and great improvement in truancy. In Stanton Elementary is an example. Even where there are very tough circumstances, 10% of the families there are in transitional housing. But they now have a PTA that is led by a father. And so in years past, Stanton didn't have an elementary. And really, you can look into the ecosystem of PTAs, and when men show up, there's something slightly different going on there. And so to have a male-led PTA there says a lot. And I think you can trace its roots back to this flamboyant interaction. And then the next step is something that I think is necessary and subversive, and that is cross-community discussions, having one community help and assist another community, and what works and what doesn't. And by virtue, by illustration, we did this last Wednesday. We have Danica was there from Capitol Hill Montessori, and we had representatives from Powell, and right there. Let's see a show of hands, great. So we brought parents from Woodson, a very successful PTA president from Woodson, successful PTA presidents from Powell and Montessori, to sit with half a dozen of our emerging PTAs in Ward 8 from our elementary schools. And what I suspected was that we would assist in what I was attempting to do was to find a way that we could assist fledgling PTAs in how do you organize, how do you advocate, how do you understand budgets, how do you fundraise, and at the same time, we can learn from each other about the challenges and opportunities we face in particular communities. But ultimately, what I'd love to see happen is this cross-fertilization across the city, because it's the best way to diminish the cynical barriers between us. Because as I travel the city, there's invariably one side of the city that thinks it's getting something that the other side didn't, or they would succeed only if they had this. And what I've seen in 16 years is that, we are equal opportunity in terms of diminishing parents' voice. And knitting together the parent groups and parents and members of the community so that they can speak with one voice against, the government is very helpful. And so, long answer, what we're doing now is we're working to create an online toolkit for parents, a how-to on PTAs, and putting together the resources of where you go to advocate for your child and how you start introducing yourself to other PTAs across the city.
I'd like to know how you feel about the truancy levels this year so far. I live in Ward 5. I live in an area where we only have now on one side of me one school, which is Phelps.
Okay.
Then on the other side of me now Webb is now KIPP, Ivy City, those schools. So how are you feeling about truancy? I know some people will know me. I'm a former employee, CJCC, and I know that we worked on some programs in two of the middle schools in regards to truancy. We brought the parents in, and they had to go through a course to be able to get back on track and go forth. So I'd like to know, how are you feeling how things are happening with some of the school closings and the truancy levels for this year?
So the truancy among the 5 to 13-year-olds, a couple of years ago, the council, required CFSA to do home visitations after 10 unexcused absences for 5 to 13-year-olds. And we've seen some, real improvements in truancy in that age range. So that's something to be excited about. The 14 to 18-year-olds, 14 to 17-year-olds is another story. So this year, one of the things we did, I offered a bill that would decrease the number of unexcused absences before there's a referral to court social services from 25 to 15. And at 10 unexcused absences, a letter goes out from under the letterhead of the Metropolitan Police Department informing parents that they are presently in violation or potentially in violation of the compulsory attendance and that they need to adjust themselves accordingly. It's too early to tell at this point how successful this measure has been. I'd like to see a whole year's experience. But we know anecdotally in the past when MPD sent the letters out, it certainly helped improve attendance. Having the involvement of the court at 15 days as opposed to 25, you're hoping to catch a problem before it really spirals out of control, I hope will be helpful. But one of the things I think is going to help with truancy is the ending of social promotion, which the council passed on second reading, another bill I offered last Tuesday. Everyone in this room knows, I'm sure, that the council, that DCPS has presently the law of DCPS is that they'll only hold the child back, or they can only hold the child back on their own in grades 3, 5th, or 8th. And so what happens is kids get passed along, and then they hit 9th grade where they have to earn an algebra or English requirement to become sophomores. And when the children are reading, the students are reading, depending on where you are, at a 4th grade level, doing math at a 4th grade level, and in some instances in the 5th grade level, they're not prepared to do that 9th grade work. And so they start to fail and they stop coming. Our truancy spikes in the 9th grade when the kids start to fail academically. So getting rid of this social promotion and making sure kids are on grade level and all the things which that bill intends to do, maybe we can talk about in a minute, I think are going to have better prepared 9th graders, especially when we talk about the at-risk allocations going forward. And having kids better prepared, I think, is going to set them up to succeed in high school and therefore go after the truancy issue. But there's no silver bullet here. This is really tough. And the fact is we lose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids a year because they aren't set up to succeed, they fail, and then we don't see them again until the criminal justice system.